Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers today to the Insights Interview podcast, which we hope is an enlightening series of academic discussions taking a deeper dive on a variety of unique topics. After this episode, be sure to check us out on YouTube, our website, www.shiaresearch.ca, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we are honored and happy to have Dr. Nebil Husayn join us again. Professor Husayn is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Miami. His research broadly considers the development of Islamic theology, historiography, and debates on the Caliphate. Husayn obtained his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University and an MA in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Harvard University. Husayn is the recipient of a Fulbright Award and the University of Miami Fellowship in the Arts and Humanities. He is the author of Opposing the Imam, published in 2021, and Caliphate and Imamate 2023, which we are here to discuss today. Some of my thoughts at the beginning are simply the past teaches us very often about the present, and this book is case in point. I always found the various Muslim approaches to political theology to be quite fascinating. They grew out of the same community and arrived at very different conclusions. At times, the intelligentsia, whether they be Sunni, Twelver, Shi'i, Ismaili, or Zaydi, would even interact with one another, yet have profoundly differing opinions on matters of great consequence. This book brings together some of the major currents on the issue of political theology and its formative writings in Islamic thought. It is really an excellent contribution to the field, not only the translation, but the superb and well-written introduction. I enjoyed reading it because it makes teaching the subject that much easier. Is an imam essential? If so, why? What are his roles? What bestows such obligations upon him? What is the role of the community, if any? If so, what part of the community? Is it Ahl al-Halli wal-Aqd? Is it the experts? These are the questions of seeming perennial importance to Islamic thought of both past and present. Who shall lead the community? What scriptural sources can be used to support such a position or its existence and its attending conclusions? These are all discussed and opined upon by a variety of scholars with different theological and legal persuasions or tendencies. These foundational points of departure affect their understanding on such issues. This translation, along with its essay by Hassan Ansari and Nebil Husayn, takes great strides in shedding light on all of the above and more. Welcome, Dr. Husayn, today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's get started here. Tell us a little bit about the subject of the imamate that you refer to. Particularly, I found the end of your introduction quite interesting because you speak about the connection between past and present and how some people claiming to be Muslims reimagine the concept of imamate or the caliphate. So maybe, although it's at the end of the introduction, but I found it so relevant to start, which is how the subject of political theology is relevant to our concerns today.
Sure. I also have a copy of the book with me.
Excellent.
And so if we want to go through it, line by line or page by page, we can do that. In terms of its relevance, I would say as a scholar or as a researcher, I'm very much interested in the imamate and debates on the imamate because I feel like it's at the center of Muslim identities. In that a run-of-the-mill Muslim could ask me, what is your legal opinion on this issue in prayer, this issue in fasting, and so on? And my response would be, whether they're Sunni or Shi'i, is, well, who are your authorities after the Prophet, right? How do you understand how to perform these rituals? Whatever denomination you belong to, this question of who are your authorities after the Quran, after the Prophet, and so on, leads to this cascading effect of not only the caliphate, but who do you follow in law? Who do you follow in theology? And so this question of authority, I think, is at the center of Muslim practice, because if you say that that person is Ali, and then the 12, or in general, the 12 Imams after the Prophet, then that makes you a 12er Shi'i. And then if you say that, it's Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and then, the companions in general have this authority, and that these schools of thought that developed based on these particular circles are authoritative, and you choose a particular one, then you answer those questions by following that school of thought that you consider most persuasive. So I think in the life of every Muslim, this question's important, whether they know it or not. It's in the background of how they even practice their own faith. Now, in terms of politics, we live in a world in which you have authoritarian rulers that exist in Muslim majority countries, and then you have some Muslims who live in democracies and enjoy democracies. And in whether you're living in Western countries or in the Middle East, the question of how do I practice my faith fully, legitimately, in the eyes of God, turns to this question of the place of religion in public life, the place in religion in criminal law, the place in religion in family law. And this is at the core, perhaps, of an impulse for a religious movement that might consider itself Islamist, meaning it's seeking a state that abides by Islamic law, in which the laws are abiding by what is considered religious law, whether you're talking about a place like Turkey, where you might have an Islamic party, or leaders that may view a utopia in which they feel that is the best case scenario, or you can be thinking of militias, Islamist militias that lead insurrections that state that this is their stated purpose. Or if you have individuals living in the West, there might be a hope that they could live in a world in which laws are passed that respect these religious practices and so on. So this question of authority, of law, the role of religion in public life, how you practice religion in private, it all goes back to questions about the Imamate, questions about religious and political authority after the Prophet, at least in my eyes. And that's why I think it's been at the center of a lot of my research, and I've been fascinated by debates about them.
Let's define the two terms, Caliphate and Imamate, the very title of the book, just so viewers and readers can be clear on what's a caliph, or who's a caliph and who's an imam, and how are these two terms similar and at once different? Just defining the title of the book.
Sure. So the caliph is understood to be the ruler of the Muslim community after the Prophet, the one who had supreme political authority. And at times, perhaps with early conceptions of this ruler, he was understood to also be the supreme religious authority, that after the Prophet, he could dictate or give opinions about religious practice, and people would follow that as well. The imama was the theoretical term, and so that would be khilafa, this idea of succession, amir, like a ruler or a khalifa, being a successor to the Prophet or the deputy of God on earth, khalifatullah. The imama is the theoretical term that theologians began to use a couple centuries after the Prophet when they discussed the subject in theological works. And they thought about idealist conceptions of succession to the Prophet. And so if you're thinking of the concept in theoretical terms, within Mu'tazili and within Shi'i circles, and then eventually even within Sunni circles, the practice was to refer to this office as the imama, meaning religious authority or even political authority, supreme authority in the community after the Prophet. So Khalifa was explicitly talking about political leadership, whereas imama was a theoretical concept that could go into idealist conceptions of the office. And I would argue within 12er Shi'ism, the distinction is very important. when we talk about 12 Shi'ism, or maybe I could say when we talk about Imami conceptions of the Imamate. Perhaps we can get to that now or later.
Sure. Now, in our recent lifetime, just a few years ago, there was a group that formed a caliphate, ISIS, also known as Daesh, the Islamic State of I think Iraq and Levant. I don't remember what it stood for again, but the so-called Islamic State.
Yes.
Now, this book is about Caliphate and Imamate. They claim to have established a caliphate. What would their, or not theirs, but what would someone like Al-Ash'ari or Juwayni or the other authors that you've chosen in this book, particularly the Sunni authors, I always wonder, just if we could imagine, what would they say about that? Based on your study, based on the analysis of their theories on political theology or political leadership and political theology.
So you had an insurrectionist group that laid claim to the caliphate. I would say that in the time of Juwayni, there were militias, there were armies that would establish dynasties in certain geographic regions and perhaps lay claim to the caliphate. There were warlords that successfully, you could say, lay claim to the caliphate, in that the Abbasid rulers or the Abbasid caliphs became symbolic. Even though the Abbasid rulers were, you could say, the rulers de jure, that they were the legitimate legal rulers of the empire, the de facto rulers were these warlords. And so Juwayni came up with a theory to incorporate an understanding in which if Muslims had to live under such rulers for hundreds of years, how would they peacefully live under such rulers and accept the claims of a militia so that they weren't obliged to basically give up their lives or to engage in this chaotic cycle of war, of constant war. And he took a minimalist or pragmatist approach in stating if the rulers agreed to allow Muslims to abide by Islamic law, they didn't have to live up to the ideals of the early caliphate. So they didn't have to be the most knowledgeable individual in the community. They didn't have to be the most virtuous person in the community. And if a legal question came up, they didn't have to know the answer to that, as long as they deferred to the authority of ulama like him, experts of the law, and they allowed experts of the law to give their legal opinions. They didn't persecute people for practicing their religion. That's the first, you could say, minimum requirement. And second, that they had the ability to obtain power and keep it. So it's a very pragmatist approach or utilitarian approach stating, power legitimates power.
It almost sounds like statecraft.
Definitely a statecraft theory. And I think it's in that way that jurists came to accept a history in which the Umayyads came to power or the Abbasids came to power, and there was lots of bloodshed, that these people were butchers, that they killed pious and and righteous individuals. And so they thought of how to deal with such a history if they believed that God allowed these things to occur. What were they asked these questions of what were the responsibilities of humans at that time. And of course, there are varying answers to it. So if the person is not allowing so you could say that Daesh was a militia that didn't allow people to practice their faith the way that the ulama directed them to practice their faith. And so there may have been a requirement to stop such bughat. So they would have been viewed as insurrectionists. And usually many of these scholars delegitimize insurrectionists who were viewed as rebels, and the ahkam of the bughat is to fight them until they're vanquished, meaning that there is a responsibility for the community, the Muslim community, to engage in self-defense against insurrectionists that are killing them, the way that Daesh reportedly did. So I think these rulers, these theorists were also statists in that they recognized legitimacy as being with rulers. And so if you had insurrectionists like Daesh, they would not have given them legitimacy, in my opinion.
Interesting. Coming to Al-Ash'ari through Ibn Furak, I was just fascinating. And I mean, I've read Al-Ash'ari, and reading him particularly through this author, the view of the past, their view, it's almost as if Al-Ash'ari through Ibn Furak almost lived in a different world than our Imami and Ismaili and Zaydi interlocutors in this book. In the way that they imagine the past is I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but it's as if they lived in different worlds, and how they understood and viewed the life of the Prophet and the companions, especially when it came to Ali ibn Abi Talib and the nature of his imamate, or the office of his leadership. I was kind of curious to understand Al-Ash'ari's, Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari's point of departure for the following. A, the idea that Muawiyah and Ali both performed ijtihad. So this idea that Muawiyah was wrong, Ash'ari makes that clear. It was ijtihad ala khata. It was on an error, right? But it was ijtihad. And he's, in that sense, God could forgive him because he tried his best. And in that ijtihad, there's may even be a sense of sincerity. I'm curious to understand Al-Ash'ari's point of departure for coming to that conclusion. It's on page 15, and we could turn to it if you like, just so we could look at the passage there. I'll read it out loud. Where this is the actual treatise. Al-Ash'ari would liken the case of Muawiyah and Ali to that of two judges who reached divergent rulings on a matter through independent reasoning. In this case, one judge may be correct while the other is mistaken, meaning Muawiyah was mistaken in rising up against Ali. On page 15.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to discuss this a little bit? I'm so fascinated, and maybe I think our viewers or listeners would be interesting as to the point of departure for how someone like Al-Ash'ari came to that conclusion. Care to opine?
Sure. I would say the context is one in which he was fully aware that Mu'tazilis had disagreed on this subject. There were some who were pro-Alid, and so they said Ali was right, Muawiyah was wrong, and Muawiyah will be punished for it. And then there are those who said we're not going to judge because there's so much uncertainty about what happened in history. And then there were others who were Uthmani and who were pro-Umayyad, and who justified to themselves that, in fact, Muawiyah was closer to the truth, and history tells us he was closer to the truth because in the end he was victorious and Ali and his family was not. And so it's in that factionalism that Adalat as-Sahaba, this doctrine of the righteousness of companions, came about, in which Hadith scholars said, we're also aware of this history, but what we will do is assume that any companion that was involved in any of these conflicts had a good intention in being involved. And so whenever we come across any texts in which they seem to be behaving badly, we're going to assume that there's some charitable way in which we can read this history, or we're just going to deny the authenticity of the text that you claim that in which they're behaving badly. So on the page that you mention, he also talks about Talha and Zubair, and he talks about these other cases in which you had companions.
Aisha as well.
Yes, you had companions who did something that he considered objectionable in the sight of God. And so for me, that means Al-Ash'ari is not denying the pro-Alid thesis that obedience to Ali was obedience to God at that time. So there's a hint of pro-Alid sentiment. You could say buried, a subtle pro-Alid line in this theory that he's protecting and that he's upholding that previously Uthmanis did not. There were theologians before him that did not uphold that line, that at the very least obedience to God during the Caliphate of Ali required obedience to Ali, right? That was a pro-Alid thesis that he is incorporating, but he's trying to maintain the line of respecting Adalat Sahaba as a Sunni. And that's, that means as a Sunni, he was afraid that if he unequivocally condemned Talha, Zubair, Aisha, or Muawiyah, that he would be punished for saying something wrong. So what is the out? How does he imagine history? He imagines their differences in the way that fuqaha disagree among themselves. That is the out. That is the best method for him. And that's why he says that Talha, Zubair, and Muawiyah participated in a type of ta'wil, that they differed on how to understand religion on the basis of independent reasoning or on the basis of ijtihad, and that gives them permission to disagree with one another. And that is a creative way of likening their disagreements to that of the fuqaha. And as we know, between fuqaha, they can disagree on everything and have very fierce disagreements. But at the end of the day, they recognize that it's not the case that, for example, God will necessarily punish a faqih who's of the same school of thought, but comes to a different opinion, because what's understood is that at least on the fundamental level, when you're part of the same school of thought, that in agreeing in the fundamentals, that these minor differences are ones in which God will show you the truth in the hereafter. That's hopefully that gives you a context of.
It does. And a question comes to mind here right away, which is, again, we're trying to go into the mind of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari through Ibn Furak, which is, what if he extended that kind of charity or charitable understanding to people outside of that generation who, let's say, rose up against the caliph of their time?
He could, but there's no necessity. Whereas there's a theological necessity to do it with people who've been promised heaven.
Yeah,
and people who've seen the prophet. And so you have to square the circle in those cases. In later cases, you could. So maybe some people will do that for the Zubairids and some people won't.
Fascinating. And then coming to the person of Ali ibn Abi Talib and his personhood in the thought of al-Ash'ari. I guess this is a really big question, but maybe you could just kind of shed a little bit of light on who was Ali in the thought of al-Ash'ari. Like who was he? Like who is the Ali ibn Abi Talib in thought of al-Ash'ari if you were to compare it to an Imami or an Ismaili or even a Zaydi, in the sense that they both love him, they both believe in him, they both clearly consider him to be among the companions of the Prophet and righteous companions. But obviously his view of Ali is, again, as if him and others were living in a very different world when it came to Ali.
Sure. I mean, rather than comparing his conception of Ali to Imami's, what I can do is read a little bit of what he says about Imam Ali and I can tell you how these are pegs, how he's responding to something. So on bottom of page 13 is when he starts. He says,
Yeah.
Al-Ash'ari held in high regard Ali's rulings and conduct as caliph in the same way that he revered Ali's predecessors. So now we're at the top of page 14. This is like the start of it. That
Yep.
very sentence tells us that the Uthmanis before Al-Ash'ari held the first three caliphs in high esteem and high regard. They idolized them. But then Ali was left to the side, right? They would reject him. Here, Ibn Furak makes it clear, no, Al-Ash'ari would include Imam Ali in that idealized concept of a caliph, right? Because he says he held Ali's ruling and conduct as a caliph in the same way that he revered Ali's predecessors. So just as there was high regard for the first three, he would hold Ali in that same way. So he reveres Ali in the same way that he reveres the first three as the leaders of the Ummah. And I think that's important because he's coming after a time period in which people had not been doing that. And then he goes on, Ali was just in his words and his actions throughout his life. So again, that's responding to, let's say, the claims of the Khawarij or the Uthmaniyya that at the end of his life, he was someone who was doing wrong. Like his predecessors, the first three, Ali was steadfast in his commitment to observing the precepts of scripture and prophetic practice. Again, the Uthmaniyya would claim that instead of following the Quran and the Sunnah, Ali followed his own right. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah says this, and his right on these issues as caliph weren't the best opinions that, that one could have given at that time. And so he's pushing back against that view. He discharged his duties with justice and equanimity. He never violated any oaths to the Prophet regarding the community's affairs, nor did Ali ever fail to abide by any instructions he may have received from the Prophet. Again, this is now you're getting into pro-Alid territory because the pro-Alids, when I say pro-Alids, I'm thinking about the Muhaddithun from Ahl al-Kufa. So it's not necessarily Shi'is, but you could say some of them were Shi'is. They've been incorporated into now the worldview of Ali post Ahmed ibn Hanbal. When you read his Musnad and you see how he includes all of that material. And Al-Ash'ari is pointing to that because before that, it was only the pro-Alids who stated Ali never violated an oath or an action that the Prophet gave him, right? And of course, this is well known among the Shia too, in believing that. And that's why he did what he did after the Prophet died, why he didn't fight when he could have, or so on and so on. He never chose to appease any enemy of God, nor did he fear or pardon such enemies. This is a very important statement. The Khawarij accused him of trying to appease Muawiyah and Amr by agreeing to arbitration in hopes of maintaining his own power. And this is a pro-Alid statement. No, that he would never have done that, and he never did that. If he was forced into arbitration, it was for other reasons, not self-interest. His inner state never contradicted his conduct in public. The Zubayrids famously said that Ali was a munafiq, and that his outer state of pretending to be an ascetic was hiding an inner state that was someone who wanted power, right? And Al-Ash'ari is also rejecting that claim. Such purity is evident in Muhammad and in the rightly guided caliphs who succeeded him. Ali refrained from claiming a right to authority during the reigns of his predecessors because he had no right to, and he knew this to be true. Now you have an Uthmani claim, a mild one.
Yeah.
But it's one that allows for compromise. It's that Ali never claimed the caliphate during the rule of the first three. He only claimed the caliphate when he became caliph.
And he knew this to be true.
And he knew this to be true.
In their view, that he had no claim to authority.
Yes. So for Al-Ash'ari, he conceives Ali as recognizing the first three as having a greater right to the caliphate and being a Sunni, so to speak. And so it goes on and on. And so I can give you a little bit of a background of how he's responding to the Nawasib, responding to the Uthmaniyya, the Umayyads, the Zubayrids, and Shi'is, and Mu'tazili, and so on. It goes on and on. But in my view, Al-Ash'ari there's a thread of pro-Alid sentiment that he is protecting and including within this new compromise or rehabilitation of Ali as a rightly guided caliph in the way of his predecessors.
And this would become what what would be, I don't like using the word mainstream, but the predominant view among the Sunnis.
Al-Ash'ari is, most Sunnis in traditional
Follow his theology, right?
were
Yeah.
theologically Al-Ash'ari or Maturidi, and their views were similar on this issue, that you could say orthodoxy included these types of views about Ali for Sunnism, for those who are Ash'ari.
But would you perhaps say, or maybe not, had it not been for Ahmad ibn Hanbal's interjection or intervention in history, Ash'ari writing what he writes about Ali ibn Abi Talib may or may not have been possible, but Ahmad ibn Hanbal certainly had a very important role to play in opening
Yeah,
the
that's
door.
a famous thesis of Madelung, and
Yeah.
Qasim Zaman narrates it, and I talk about it in my first book, Opposing the Imam. Uh, it's quite possible as a muhaddith, Ahmed ibn Hanbal's intervention in including all of those
Mhm.
all of that pro-Alid material, it allowed others to also include it. But I would say, I would caution against that. He could be a signal of changing times when he did what he did, but he may not have been the only one, right? So you have other muhaddithun who do the same thing. So, for example, Tabarani has a lot of,
Yeah.
uh, you know,
Mhm.
um, there are just many other individuals who do the same thing, where they're including a lot of pro-Alid material.
Yeah.
If you read Firdaus al-Akhbar and the Fadal literature, Nasa'i, and so on, there are others who do the same. So it would be hard to say that only one person did it. I would say it was in the water, because the context was one in which you had a caliph, namely Al-Ma'mun, who argued for Tafdil Ali, and you had theologians, namely Baghdadi Mu'tazila, who also argued for Tafdil Ali. And you had, soft Shi'is, so to speak, such as Batris and Zaydis, and you had Imamis, all of these individuals at the turn of the, third century, or, the early 200s, all of these people recognized Ali as the preeminent Muslim after the Prophet. And in response to that, you had what what one might call proto-Sunnis or muhaddithun and fuqaha, who also said, yes, not that the Umayyads are gone and we live in this new world in which he is respected, we can also rehabilitate him and include him in our worldview as a hero and as an icon. But I would say before Ahmed ibn Hanbal, you had, let's say, fuqaha like Abu Hanifa and Ash-Shafi'i, who respected Imam Ali as a faqih and who respected him as a caliph and as a source of knowledge. And I doubt that they viewed him as illegitimate like the Uthmani. I think they viewed him as both a source of legal authority, but also a political authority at that time. It's just that the impact of their views or the clarity of how they talked about these things aren't clear to us compared to hadith that are narrated through Ahmed ibn Hanbal, which are clearly pro-Alid.
Of course, from the 3rd and the 4th century, I mean, we have so much more material, right?
But I'm saying Abu
Yeah.
Hanifa and Shafi predate Ahmed
Predate.
ibn.
Yeah. From that early period, we're just not aware, or we can't really say for certain what their actual views were with more clarity compared to Ahmed ibn Hanbal or Al-Ash'ari or on and on later
Right.
on, because we just have more available material.
Exactly. So like Ahmed ibn Hanbal is mentioned because he notes himself that
Mhm.
there was a time in which he may have believed in three, or others note there was a time in which he upheld three because he's coming from the Levant where that was a norm. And then he said it was bid'ah to only believe in three caliphs, and so he considered it heresy if someone said they believed in three.
Which brings us to the issue of geography. Levant, right? Which is basically, like, I guess, greater
Yeah.
Syria. You mentioned Levant, Basra, and Egypt in the book. Don't have to go into too much detail, but Kufa, of course, we're aware of. Kufa has such a famous history of being a Shi'i hotbed and a place of great debate and discussion. Now, Levant, Basra, and Egypt, why are these important centers for the concept of imama and political leadership? Or maybe even general, maybe just generally, like, was it because there were some of the scholars that you discuss in this book were based out of there, or there were prominent madrasas or schools there where Islamic theology was being taught, or where political theology was being opined upon? Is it because of the Umayyads? Or maybe
Sure.
all of that?
Yeah, I would say all of that is relevant in terms of, Damascus and greater Syria or Sham, the Levant. You had many muhaddithun that were based there. Wherever you have strong rulers and authority that can provide um, stipends to ulama, that gives them the ability to do their research, to publish books, and to share their views. And the Levant had been a center under the Umayyads. And after them, the Mamluks also established a dynasty there in which they are supportive uh, of Sunni scholarship. It has a history of, in terms of Levant, there's a history of scholars coming to Damascus, living there, a book culture that's important. Sufism thrives in Damascus as well. All of those things play a role in why you have literature until today, where if it's in manuscript form, we can find it in the Levant. You had empires, you had schools that were established there, you had scholars that came there. Was Quds was a holy city, and so it's not just, let's say, Jerusalem, but there's also Mecca and there's Medina. Um, these holy cities, these pilgrimage sites are places where scholars base themselves and where they would live because they viewed it as a holy place. And so it was an opportunity to meet people in these regions. Um, and so these scholarly networks, you could say, were important on why people would choose that as a destination. In terms of Basra, I would say it's an ancient city in terms of Islamic scholarship. You had Uthmanis who were definitely based in Basra. You had the Khawarij, the Ibadis, or the early Khawarij that were based in Basra. And then later on, you had the Mu'tazili school in the second and third centuries. There was a Basran school that developed its own epistemology or its own assumptions about theology. Um, and then after that early period, you had other scholars, muhaddithun who are Uthmani, who are Sunni, that were based in Basra. And so, yes, you had schools established there. Uh, when in terms of networks, we haven't talked about Iran, like Nishapur or Khurasan. All of these places, I would say something that they have in common is that you have dynasties that are established there in which they become a source of patronage for scholars. They're willing to build schools. And so if you have rulers with wealth, they're willing to build schools. Scholars will come, they'll pay a good stipend for you to become a judge. In addition to you having informal teaching circles, this will allow people to come there as a destination. And so you had Shafi'i Ash'aris in these networks between Nishapur and Mecca and Iraq, Baghdad. You had Hanafis and Maturidis in these networks as well, and you had all of these schools have these networks. For the Imamis, it's Baghdad, it's Qom, it's these major cities where you have um, eventually also endowments. So if you have these big schools and you have families that are well off, they'll establish endowments to allow these schools to run without without state funding. And so if they're independently run as well, I should say independently funded, this allows scholars to come to these sites and live there and flourish there.
Fascinating. and talk about the Caliphate and Imamate, among other things. Okay, another question came to my mind. Is belonging to the Quraysh a condition for imama? That's something that is discussed in the book. And how would it differ between Sunnis and Shi'is? Why is the Quraysh important?
Well, I would say there are multiple theological schools here, and I'd say at least one, the Ibadis, said it was not they explicitly said that it was not a requirement for the leader of the community to be a Qurashi. For Sunnis and Shi'is, I would say the reason why lineage became important, even with the rational or rationalist edge that some of them turned to having, let's say, with Juwayni and after him, after the 5th century, they would say in deference to the Sunnah. Like, even if we're not going to rationalize why Qurashi lineage is important, if we have a text, a statement from the Prophet saying that it is, then in deference to the Prophet, we'll say that it is. So for Sunnis, they said that, when he says A'immatun min Quraysh, that the Imams will be of Quraysh, that this is a text from him that we're not going to ignore. And that when the companions discuss this issue, we have texts that state Abu Bakr, Omar, and these other individuals said that this was a statement that they heard from the Prophet, and then that the Ansar assented, that those who are not Qurashi assented to this. And so it becomes a type of understanding that there was a consensus that this was a belief. Among Shi'is, they'll say the same thing in terms of Nas, that Ali was appointed by the Prophet, and that there are these texts that tell us that they are that they have a greater right to the imama. Whether if Zaydis who will say that the nobler lineages have a greater right to it, or Imamis who will say they've been explicitly designated as successors of the Prophet, and that there is a purity to those who have been explicitly designated. I would say as an outsider, without any knowledge of these topics before when I began, let's say as an undergrad decades ago, when I understood the imamate as being one in which any descendant of the Prophet was viewed as a legitimate candidate for Zaydis versus within Twelver Shi'ism, where there was this strict line of imams based on designation and infallibility, I thought the Zaydi theory sounded more egalitarian between the descendants of the Prophet. It's like, oh, the person could be a descendant of Hassan or Hussein. But then when I read the rationalist justification that's given here, it was one that was similar to Juwayni, and it wasn't persuasive. It was one where An-Natiq bil-Haq, or Abu Talib al-Haruni, explains that, well, we believe that the imamate is a right of any descendant of Fatima, because no one disagrees in the Muslim community that the descendants of Fatima have the noblest of lineages. And were an imam or caliph to come to power that was not someone who possessed such a lineage, then a usurper or a claimant could rise up and claim that he is nobler than the caliph in lineage, and therefore he has a greater right to it. To me, that sounded like a very measly argument in terms of leadership. If you're claiming that the person in power is the most knowledgeable, most righteous, most courageous, valiant in warfare, has reached a level where no one is similar to him, that he is afdal in all of these ways, but you're claiming that lineage, a claimant who doesn't have those characteristics but has nobler lineage has a greater right to it, that didn't seem persuasive to me. But this is what Juwayni says when he says, look, there are these there are these necessary characteristics for an imam or a caliph. And because we have texts from the Prophet that state lineage is a requirement, we will defer to that. But if that is the case, it's only so that there aren't other claimants that claim to be nobler than him, which would cause fitna, which would cause dissension. I think, I don't know, 1400 years later, that doesn't sound, to me, that doesn't sound compelling. And I've told you that, or maybe I haven't stated it in public before, that when I was writing this book and going through each treatise carefully, the beautiful thing that we did in this book was choose authors who represented their theological school in ways where it was a fully formed school that understood that there were differences of opinion on it. And in the exercise that we did with Al-Ash'ari, you saw how they responded to that, whether it was subtly or explicitly. And so when I engulfed myself in each chapter, I can sincerely tell you that when I was reading these texts and translating them, I respected the author as I was reading that author, and I gave my life, or I gave my time to that author for those months, as if they were the most knowledgeable person in the room. And I would be persuaded every time I finished, as I was reading it, and by the time I was done with it, I said, he did it the best. And then I would get to the next verse and I said, no, he did it the best.
He did it.
And then I get to the next verse, oh, he did it the best. And that for me is the joy of reading these types of texts when you're in the room with someone who's knowledgeable, that even if you, at the end of the day, you disagree with them, you recognize the beauty of some of their arguments when they are a knowledgeable person and they respectfully disagree, and so on. And so in terms of yeah, some of these questions, I'm, with the question that you asked about the Quraysh, the lineage of the Quraysh, I usually expected to be persuaded by another side when I would read their discussion on it. But this question of lineage, it wasn't persuasive for me when I got to it on this topic. To me, it sounded like the most pragmatic opinion was the Ibadi one, which is, this is beside the point. It doesn't matter who, what the lineage is of the person in terms of being an administrator over the political affairs of the Muslim community.
Yeah. Now, this is certainly where the 12 Shi'is and the Ismailis would have a very clear position on. Let's get to that now. Well, let's start first of all with the 12ers and the concept of Lutf.
Sure.
Right? And what role does this concept of divine grace have to play in the imama for the 12 Shi'is as you've presented in this text? It's something you've mentioned a few times in the text and discussed. I think it's quite important because it plays a very important role in what would become 12 Shi'i, like a fully formed 12 Shi'i conception of the Imamate. Yeah.
I guess I could also preface it again with
Yeah.
a little background. How is it that I could read about the Imamate for decades without fully diving into the concept of Lutf, diving into the concept of what I would call an essential quality or essential doctrine of Imami schools? And so these Imami schools isn't just 12 Shi'ism, but it includes Ismailism, and then it includes Imamis that existed before the occultation of the 12th Imam.
Yeah.
Right? That this was a core doctrine, and it was one that goes a little bit, something like this, that for there to be humans on earth and there to be a God, it would be unbecoming of God to leave humans without guidance. And it's unbecoming of God. You could say if humans are in need of something, not to offer that need to them. And when I say need, I guess maybe that's a technical term. If if there is a necessity for humans in terms of their guidance, it would be unbecoming for God not to provide that to them. The reason why I can't say unjust or I can't say unwise, like it doesn't agree with adala or doesn't agree with hikmah, is some early imamis were careful not to say that this concept of lutf is is based on this idea of the hikmah of God or the adalat of
Divine
God.
justice. Yeah.
Yeah, they're careful not to explicitly state it that way and tie it to that. They would say like la yajuz, but they're not explaining exactly why la yajuz, like why it's not allowed. It could be due to hikmah, it could be due to adala. In some cases, maybe it's compassion in other. But so in this Imami conception of the world, God must provide guidance that is necessary for humans. That means, but that does not mean that God must provide revelation or prophets, right? There could be times in which a community does not have a prophet or revelation, scripture, law that they must abide by. But Imamis believe that God must provide some sort of guidance. And so the conclusion to that, rationally speaking, is that if there's no prophet or no scripture in a world that you're picturing, let's say 100,000 years ago, then at the very least, that guidance is through a person that represents God, an imam, so to speak. This person is the representative of God. And so this person could represent morality. He could be an example in terms of teaching people morality. Um, but to keep it as general as possible, Imam Al-Tusi or Sheikh Al-Tusi and Sharif Murtada um, held that this person's role would be to bring society closer to obedience so that they are aqrab ila ta'a and farther away from disobedience, whatever way the imam can. And so if it's in a context that we're thinking of in which there's no law, no um, revelation, then this person could serve as in a leadership capacity, or this person can serve as a teacher. Um, and then if it's in a time in which revelation and law has already been promulgated through a prophet, then this person has a second role of hifd sharia, protecting the law from interpolation and misapplication and so on. Whether we're talking about pre-revelatory periods or post-revelatory periods, this person plays that role
Mhm.
in being the guide. And so and in doing that, this person must be infallible. They would say someone who represents God fully, someone whom people can defer to in anything and everything. Um, and this concept of the imama, again, is based on this word that you used, lutf, this idea that God must provide out of his divine grace some sort of guidance. And this concept is something that is completely different from the question that you asked me of whether the ruler of the community must have lineage that
In
goes through.
Quraysh. Mm.
This is beyond that. This is a theological, this is a ontological question of how you understand the
Yeah.
role of humanity and the role of God. This is beyond governance, politics, who succeeded the prophet, who should be a ruler 200 now versus, this is how do you understand the role of God and guidance in the lives of humans so that they are protected from the hellfire.
Yeah.
And it's one that says from the beginning of time until the end of time, there is someone who must represent God. It can just be one person. And at least one person should be following God fully and have access to, this ilm, this knowledge of God from God. And it's a compelling argument of guidance because it can exist in any condition, whether it's one of law, whether it's one without law, whether it's one where you have scripture, or it's one that you don't. That Imam, I keep on saying Imam. It's like a Sheikh al-Ta'ifa, Sheikh al-Tusi even gives us hypotheticals. What if there are only two people left on Earth? What if there was only one person left? And he talks about how, and they're like, and they say that person wouldn't have the ability to do dhulm or oppression against anyone else. Why would there be a need for an imam or like, this idea of guidance? And he says God would need to provide guidance for that person in case they ever encountered another human so that they learn not to do
An
injustice.
ontological principle.
It's it's a core principle.
Yeah.
And I think he does an excellent job of rationally considering challenges to the
Which
concept.
brings us to the final question, which I would like you to spend a little bit of time on, which is the ghaiba, which is the occultation of 12th Imam, which you do discuss in the book. And how does Tusi or Imamis in general, and I'm just finished a project on the occultation of the 12th Imam, but from Sheikh al-Mufid, so I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. How do they square this with an absent Imam?
Sure, it's
Entering the mind of a 12 Shi'i theologian and scholar, that period, how do they defend this concept of an occult Imam? How do they support it? Based on what you've just mentioned, how does this concept of Lutf play out with an absent Imam or an Imam that is not immediately accessible?
right. Atusi provides different ways in which one could understand this. He says that there's a theory that some ulama follow, and then there's another one. And he doesn't fully discredit either, just to stay on solid ground. Um, if I could share a little bit about myself, again, as an outsider looking in, my initial assumption about the ghaiba or the occultation was that the imam in occultation was like Muslim beliefs about al-Masih, about the Messiah, Jesus ibn Maryam, son of Mary, that this was a figure who had been on earth and God raised him up into the heavens, and at the end of time, this person will come back. That is a general belief that Muslims hold about
Yeah.
Jesus. I was under the impression that she's held the 12 Shi'is held the same view of the occulted Imam, that he was amongst the community, he was taken away because of fear for his life or danger, and at the end of the time, he comes back. At-Tusi clarifies that that is not the case, that the Imam who isn't present before the public is still an Imam who's active. In that the difference is when an Imam is present before the community, they can point to that person and say, there he is right there. I know his person. They recognize that person as the Imam of his time. Whereas in occultation, the Imam continues to work in his community. as a teacher, as a guide, in doing whatever fulfills the role of bringing people aqrab ila ta'a, meaning bringing them closer to obedience, or keeping them farther away from immorality.
And
But
hifz
people
sharia as well, right?
and hifd al-sharia, right? He's fulfilling all of those roles in ways that are subtle, in ways in which people do not know that this is the imam's, this is the fruit of the imam's labor. So he is not, again, this was a mischaracterization that I had of what occultation means versus the idea that of Jesus's, you could say, ascension into the heavens, where he's not engaged in any, that character, that person is not engaged in any activity after his ascension, and he'll engage in some activity when he returns. Whereas it's that no, the Imam continues to work, but the identity, but he keeps his identity concealed.
هو خفي.
That his yes, his identity is concealed. That's how I would understand that. So Zaydis and Mu'tazilis understood this argument from Sharif Murtada, and they began responding. And so Sheikh Al-Tusi provides responses, and Sharif Murtada as well. One of the arguments that they made is that, well, part of bringing people closer to obedience and keeping them farther away from misguidance is to have this public role as a judge, as someone who implements God's laws in public. How can the Imam do this if he is concealing his identity? And Tusi makes an argument that, and perhaps he's drawing on Al-Murtala, that for Imamis who have already recognized the authority of his ancestors, that they taught laws, or they taught the application of the Quran, or they taught the sayings of the Prophet and the previous Alid Imams that would keep people closer to guidance and keep them farther away from misguidance, that you could say the lessons have already been provided for the community, and it's for them to take them. As for the day-to-day temptation that an imami might have, or another member of the community might have, to commit a crime or to engage in sin, Atosi says you don't need to have the police officer standing right there watching you for you not to steal. It's an awareness that eventually, that number one, the police officer could find out, and number two, that you could be held accountable in this world, in addition to fear of what happens to you in the hereafter, that would keep a person from, let's say, theft. And he says the same thing about the Imam who's in occultation. You never quite know if he's actually physically there watching you or not, because again, his identity is concealed to you. He might be there in that specific instance. But even if he is not, it's fear that you might be held accountable to him if he were to present himself to you, that would keep an imami from engaging in these actions. So it becomes this debate of, is he a lutf only for imamis or a lutf for all of humanity? And so Al-Tusi continues, in explaining how some have thought of it this way and some have thought of it that way. And is he in concealment because of a danger to his life that was posed in the past? And then what if that danger is no longer exists? Why would he continue to? And then he continues the argument there and explaining why, the Imam could use his own discretion on when it would best serve him to make his identity public to others. And it goes on and on and on and on. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time today. But this was a really wonderful conversation. We hope to have you in person in the near future, where we can dive into some of these texts. Thank you for joining us, to all our listeners and viewers up to this point. Visit our website, social media, YouTube channel for more content. If you enjoyed today's conversation, think about contributing to the Shia Research Institute to help drive more quality content in the future. And we hope you will join us for our next episode. Once again, thank you, Dr. Husayn, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.